The next time you're at the Dollar Tree, head over to the Peel and Stick Wallpaper, pick out a few of your favorite patterns, and I'm going to show you how you can use them in your DIYs. I like to use stacked books in my decorating. So from the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 hardcover books. One was slightly larger than the other one, and I also grabbed 2 different patterns of the Peel and Stick wallpaper. These books were small enough that I was able to just use one piece for each book. And you can see here, I laid my book down first and I folded the piece over to make sure that it would fit the whole way over the book and it would have enough room to spare on each of the edges. Now, to make this a little bit easier to cover, I only peeled back half of the backing to start, and then I laid my book down and I made sure that I had a border going the whole way around the book on the free edges. Then once I had all of that laid down in place and it was nice and secure, I folded it over, I peeled off the rest of the backing, and then I just smoothed it over the front of the book. There is a little bit of a crease on the edge of the book where the binding is, and I just made sure that I pushed down with my finger so that it would show off that crease as well. I opened up the book and you can see the creases in the paper where the binding of the book is. I wanted to free those out because that piece is going to get folded separate from the 2 covers. So you can see here, I just created a little flap with my scissors, and I did that on both sides. I also cut an angle towards the tab, and this will just make it easier when I'm folding everything down. It takes some of the bulk out. I also needed to remove some of the excess paper in each of the 4 corners, so I just took my scissors and cut an angle going through the corner. Also keep in mind, as you're cutting through the corner of the book cover, just make sure you keep your scissors about 1/8 of an inch away from the corner, and this will just help make sure that once you fold everything down that the corner gets covered completely by the paper and you won't see any of the actual book sticking through. After all my corners were mitered, I could start folding in my little flaps. So I started with the top and bottom of the book and I just folded those 2 flaps down. I'm using a bone folder here to make sure that that wallpaper really sticks to the inside cover of my book. And then when I got to the long side of my book, I just made sure that the corners were nice and smooth, and as I folded the flap down, I pressed everything into place, and then like I said, I used my bone folder here just to make sure that everything was nice and adhered. Now, if you don't have a bone folder, just use any kind of object in your craft room. You could use a ruler, or if you have a vinyl cutting machine, you probably have a Cricut scraper or something like that. You could use that too. You don't have to have a bone folder for this part. And then I just repeated that on the other cover as well. You have a couple different options when it comes to that little flap at the binding. I chose to cut most of the paper off, and then I just folded it over and tucked it in so that it covered up that little part of the book cover that was still sticking out. But if you didn't feel like messing with that, you could just cut the flap off completely and you wouldn't even notice. I covered my second book in a different pattern of the peel and stick wallpaper, but you could use 2 of the same pattern if you'd like. You can keep this book stack just how it is, but I wanted to decorate mine up. So I took a piece of burlap ribbon. I didn't bother tying it into a bow. I just wrapped it around the 2 books and tied it into a knot, and then I dovetailed the ends. I also grabbed a couple pieces of greenery from my stash. I bundled them together, wrapped the stems with some jute cord, and then tucked it under the ribbon. Probably seen these small wooden crates at the Dollar Tree, and I want to show you 2 different ways you can make gifts and put them in one of these crates. For the first set of gifts, I'm using 1 sheet of the peel and stick wallpaper. I also picked up a small notepad from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to be using a few clothespins as well as a few magnets. My notepad measures 4 inches across, so I'm going to start by cutting a piece of the wallpaper down to 4 inches. This wallpaper is basically a big piece of sticky paper, so it was really easy to trim with my paper trimmer. I also trimmed the length down to 9 inches, but make sure you take your own measurements for your notepad because they do vary slightly and you might use a different notepad. So just take your own measurements and cut the piece down to the size you need. Then I peeled off part of the backing from the wallpaper. I lined the top edge off with the banding strip at the top of my notepad, and I smoothed that into place. Again, I'm using a bone folder here because I think it really just helps burnish it down. Then I opened up the notepad and I started to fold the excess paper in towards the center and burnish it into place. You could decorate the front of the notepad however you like. I took some alphabet stickers that I had on hand and I spelled out the word hello. Anytime I'm placing small stickers like this as a word, I always like to line them up on my ruler first. I think it just makes it easier to transfer them onto whatever I'm working on. I also had some of these flat back pearls, so I added a few of those onto the front of my notebook as an extra embellishment. For my clothespin magnets, I'm going to create a set of 4. So I cut a piece of the scrap from the wallpaper and I'm cutting it down to 3 inches by 3/8 of an inch. Also keep in mind, depending on what pattern you're using of wallpaper, you may want to adjust where you're cutting on it so that you can get a bit of pattern on each of these pieces. Since they are so tiny, there's a good chance that if you just cut straight across, you're going to end up with kind of a blank piece of paper. So just watch to see where the pattern is falling and make sure that you have a little bit of pattern on each of the strips. After my strips were cut, I just peeled off the backer and I laid it across the front of my clothespin. If there was a little excess paper on one of the edges, I just trimmed it off with my scissors. And then to coordinate my magnets with my notepad that I created, I added 3 of those flat back pearls to the front of each of the clothespins. I happen to have some adhesive magnet sheets in my stash, so I was able to use those for on the back of my clothespins. I just cut them down into strips, peeled off the backer, and stuck it on the back of my clothespin. Now, if you don't have something like this, check your refrigerator because I know a lot of businesses like to hand out magnets, and if you have a couple extra of those on hand that you're not using, you could cut those into strips and they would probably fit on the back of your clothespins as well. But if you don't have something like that, you can always buy small disc magnets too. I also wanted to share with you a fun way to package these clothespins up before putting them in the crate. I cut a piece of cardstock down to 4 inches by 2 inches, and then I clipped each of the clothespins onto this cardstock. Now you could leave it like this and just place it in the crate with a notepad, but I thought I would take it one step farther. I happen to have a set of clear bags on hand that measure 4 5/16 of an inch by 7.5 inches. I slid my clothespins into the clear bag, and then I did have another scrap piece of that wallpaper. So once I had my bag sealed up, I just folded the wallpaper over the top of the bag to look like a topper. And then because I've been using those flat back pearls, I added a few of those just to help coordinate everything together. And since I still had scrap pieces from this one sheet of wallpaper, I thought I would decorate the crate too. I cut 2 strips down that measured 5.5 inches by 3/4 of an inch. This is what fit on my crate, but make sure you take your own measurements. And I just added the decorative strip to the center part of the front and the back side of my crate. As a final touch, I took those same flat back pearls and I put one on each end of the crate to look like rivets holding everything in place. I added some paper shred to the bottom of my crate. I tucked in my notebook and my magnet clothespins, and then I also found a fancy pen at the Dollar Tree and added that to complete this gift. Second gift idea I had was to make a set of coasters and a set of napkin rings. I'm using some of these wood squares that I already had on hand, a few pieces of felt. I'm going to be using the same pattern of wallpaper so that it matches the crate that I created. And from the kitchen section of the Dollar Tree, I grabbed a pack of these flexible cutting mats. You get 2 in a pack, and these come in handy in the craft room as well as the kitchen. If you don't have wood squares in your craft room, go to the crafter square section of the Dollar Tree and look for these 2 packs of ceramic tiles. They come in squares and circles. My wood squares are pretty thin, so I wanted to double mine up to make them thicker. I'm just using some hot glue and I'm sandwiching 2 of them together. My wood squares measure 4 7/8 by 4 7/8, so I'm cutting my wallpaper down to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and this will allow for a small border around the outside. I noticed that the corners of my wood squares were rounded, so I wanted to round the corners of my wallpaper as well. I have a corner rounder by We Are Memory Keepers. It's double-sided. One side does a 1/4 inch corner round and one side does a 1/2 inch corner round. I'll make sure I have that linked in the description box below. Then all I needed to do was peel the backer off of my wallpaper and center it within my wood square tile. After I had all of my wallpaper stuck down to my wood squares, I moved on to my felt pieces and I cut 4 pieces down to 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Then I used some hot glue and I just hot glued a piece of felt to the backside of each of my coasters. I wanted to make sure that that wallpaper wouldn't peel up or lift off of my coasters, so I placed a small amount of gloss finish Mod Podge on each of my coasters, and I did give each of them 2 coats. Moving on to my napkin rings, I'm cutting that flexible cutting mat down into strips. I'm using a paper trimmer here. If you didn't have a paper trimmer, just use a Sharpie to mark out the strips that you'll need. I'm cutting mine down to 5.5 inches by 1 inch. Next, I started cutting my wallpaper down to rectangles that measured 2.5 inches by 7 inches. It might seem kind of funny that I used 2 different paper trimmers, one for the cutting mat and one for the wallpaper, but with this style of paper trimmer, I don't like to cut any kind of thick material because it wears out the blade too fast. Then I got to work covering those pieces of cutting mat, so I just peeled the backer off and I laid the strip of cutting mat down in the center of it. I folded all the edges over. I did the long edges first to make sure that they wrapped the whole way around that strip. Then the excess that was on each end of that strip of cutting mat, I just cut off with scissors. Now, because this cutting mat is thicker, I wouldn't recommend using hot glue to attach your 2 ends together to form a ring. So what I did is I folded it into a ring and then I used my tiny attacher, which is just a mini stapler, and I added about 5 staples going across the surface to make sure that everything would be held together. If you don't have the tiny attacher, just use a regular stapler, but I don't think any kind of glue would be strong enough to help keep that ring shape. Of course, I don't want those staples snagging on the napkins and I don't want them to show, so I took some coordinating ribbon that I already had. I added a bit of hot glue to the inside of the napkin ring, laid the ribbon into it, and then wrapped it around the outside, added more hot glue to the inside of the ring, and stuck the other end of the ribbon in place. Now be careful with what kind of ribbon you're using here. This one's pretty thick, so I probably could have added some hot glue on the outside, but I never like to take that chance that you'll be able to see the bumps from the hot glue through ribbon, so I always try to make sure that I'm hot gluing where you won't be able to see it. And just like with the last gift, I tucked some paper shred into the bottom of that wooden crate. I added my coasters and my napkin rings, and my gift is complete. I'm always looking for something new to create to hang on my front door. I grabbed one of these wood bead wreaths from the Crafter Square section of the Dollar Tree, and I'm also using 2 pieces of the wallpaper in the same pattern. I'm using one of these charger plates from the Dollar Tree. It's about 3 inches bigger than that wood bead wreath. I'm just laying it down on a piece of thin cardboard and tracing around it to use as a pattern. After I had my cardboard circle cut out, I laid it down on a piece of the wallpaper, and these wallpaper pieces are meant to work together. So you're supposed to be able to line them up from top to bottom or side to side, and the pattern should just continue on. So I took my second piece of wallpaper because you can see that first piece didn't quite cover that circle the whole way. And I did have to find the right place to line it up, but I was able to get the pattern to match up pretty well. You could see the seam a little bit where the 2 pieces came together, but it really was pretty camouflaged. I was pretty happy with how the pattern lined up. After I had that second piece in place on my cardboard circle, then I just went around the edges and cut off some of the excess, but I wanted to leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inch border the whole way around. Also keep in mind, if you didn't want to use these wallpaper pieces or you can't find them at your store, the Dollar Tree always has a pretty good selection of printed contact paper that you could use instead. Once I had all of the excess paper cut off from around my cardboard circle, I started cutting tabs into it. These tabs were about 1/2 inch to 1 inch wide, and I went the whole way around the circle, and this will just help make it easier when I go to fold everything towards the back. And you can see here, as I'm folding all of these tabs down, it just creates a cleaner edge on the outside of the cardboard circle. This part's optional, but my front door has a big piece of glass in it, and I knew if I hung this on my front door, I would see the backside of this circle from the inside of my house. So I just cut a piece of craft paper that was slightly smaller than my cardboard circle, and I hot glued it to the backside. Before putting everything together, I wanted to create a little decoration for the top of my wood bead wreath. I gathered up some greenery and some little flowers. I created 2 small bundles and I connected them in the center with some clear tape. I used some jute cord and I wrapped from one edge of the bundle to the other. And then I used that same jute cord. I used 2 lengths of it and I created just a simple bow to put in the center. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know I love to use my Crop-A-Dile to punch holes in thicker material. So I punched 2 holes at the top of my cardboard circle, and then using a zip tie, I just ran it down through the bottom hole and then back up through the top, and I laid my wood bead wreath into it and closed it shut. That way I wasn't using any hot glue on this wood bead wreath, and it'll stay nice and secure at the top with the zip tie. I hot glued my flower bundle to the top of the wood bead wreath, and then I used some thinner nautical rope and I started hot gluing it all around the edge of the cardboard circle. Once I got to the top, I extended the pieces out and tied them in a knot, and this way the rope gave a nice finish to the edge of the cardboard, and it also gave me a way to hang it. The next time you're in the Dollar Tree, head over to the party planning aisle and grab one of these trays that has 3 sections to it. I'll show you how you can give it a quick makeover. It was finally warm enough here in PA that I could start spray painting, so I took my tray outside and I gave it 2 coats of this Rust-Oleum 2x paint and primer combo. This is my favorite paint to use on plastic. I think it holds really well and it gives a good coverage. After my paint was dry, I started cutting down my wallpaper to fit on the inside of the tray in the bottom of each of the sections. The 2 end sections are the same size, so I cut 2 pieces down to 2 5/8 by 5 7/8, and the middle section's just a little bit larger. I cut that down to 3 1/8 by 5 7/8. To finish off my tray, all I needed to do was lay my wallpaper in the bottom of each section. Now I had a couple different ideas of how you could use this tray. Obviously, since it's spray painted, you wouldn't want to serve food in it, but if you host a lot of picnics or barbecues, this would be a good way to organize some of your plastic utensils. You could put forks, spoons, and knives in each of the section. Or if you want to use it in your home, this would be a great way to organize some school supplies or craft supplies. And it would make a great addition to a vanity or a bathroom to organize some makeup or hair tools like hairbrushes, makeup brushes, hair products, or lipstick, mascara, anything like that. These organizing cubes from the Dollar Tree always come in handy, but sometimes you can't tell what's in them because they don't have a label on the front. So using some of this wallpaper, I'm going to create some labels for the front of these bins. I went over to the sticker section and I also grabbed a pack of these chalkboard stickers. These come in a bunch of different shapes, but I'm going to go with just the regular rectangle shape for this project. I'm also going to be using some chipboard. If you don't have any of this on hand, just use some cardboard or some foam board. And I picked out a piece of wallpaper that would match the gray color of the bin. bin. I measured the front of my bin and I determined that I wanted the size of my label to be 5 inches by 3.5 inches. And I'm creating 3 different storage bins because that's what I need for in my house. So I am cutting out 3 pieces of chipboard. I needed to cut my wallpaper down so that it was about 1 inch bigger on both sides, so I cut my pieces down to 6 by 4.5 inches. I peeled the backing off of my wallpaper piece and I took that chipboard and I just centered it within the back of it so that I had about a 1/2 inch border the whole way around. I needed to take some of the bulk out of the corners before I folded all the edges in, so I'm just taking my scissors and I'm running a diagonal right across the corner. And you can see here I have a little bit of a gap between the corner of the chipboard and where I cut the paper. Then I could just take the chipboard and lay it down on my work surface and pull my piece towards me, and this will help fold the flaps in a little bit smoother. As I was pulling all the flaps in, I was just running my bone folder around to make sure that the paper was nice and burnished. I picked out 3 of the largest rectangles from my chalkboard stickers and I put one in the center of each of my tags. I used a Velcro dot to attach my tag to my bin, but I think I would have rather used a roll of the Velcro from the Dollar Tree so that I could have made it the same length as my tag. But the dots work also, it's just I think it would have been sturdier with a longer strip of Velcro. So much for coming to hang out in the craft room with me again today. If you need even more DIY inspiration, check out one of the videos I left on the screen. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.